Okay, so in this video, I'm going to be looking at the 21 MCU films leading up to Avengers Endgame, ranking them not based on how good they are, how good the writing is, or the action, or anything like that. It's going to be based on how relevant they are to Avengers Endgame. And by relevant, I mean when watching Avengers Endgame, when you see a certain scene or a certain line or something like that that references another movie, how important is it for you to understand that reference, or how much of a difference does it make if you understand that reference versus if you don't understand the reference, okay? And this will have spoilers, so if you don't want to see the spoilers, you can just skip to the end. I'll probably put a time code on the screen so you know where to skip to. We'll start with Iron Man. You've got some pretty big stuff in this movie. I mean, it establishes the character of Iron Man. When he's in the cave, he talks to Yinsen and he tells him, I have no family, I have nothing. It establishes how important Pepper is to him, and specific references. The line before he does the snap at the end of this film, he says, "I am Iron Man." Of course, that's a direct reference to the film Iron Man. You wouldn't understand if you hadn't seen it. Additionally, at his funeral, there is the arc reactor, which says, proof Tony Stark has a heart. Again, a very direct reference to this film, and it's a very impactful moment that wouldn't mean anything at all if you hadn't seen Iron Man. So we're going to put Iron Man at the top tier. All right, Incredible Hulk. Yeah, pretty much no references in the movie at all to the Incredible Hulk. So bottom tier. Iron Man 2 is kind of relevant. It establishes that he didn't really have a great relationship with his father. That's also mentioned in Iron Man. Oh yeah, that's another thing from Iron Man, is that he says, after he gets out of the cave, he says, "I want a cheeseburger and I want to call a press conference." And the cheeseburger is referenced at the end of Avengers Endgame, as well as what he says in the press conference about how he never got to say goodbye to his dad. So anyway, a lot of things. Anyway, Iron Man 2 further fleshes out Tony's relationship with his dad was not that great. Tony's gets a video from his dad, which is kind of reflected in this movie when they watch the video from Tony at the end of the film. It's kind of referenced, but it's not extremely important to understanding the emotional impact. So we're going to put it at mid-tier because it is relevant, but it's only relevant if you know it is relevant. Yeah, so the thing about Thor is it establishes the concept of worthiness. You have to be worthy to wield the hammer. However, I would say that very little about Thor's general arc in Endgame is related to the film Thor. If anything, I guess it starts out with Odin saying, "You were born to be a king." And of course, the end of this film, he gives that up completely. We're going to put it at mid-tier with Iron Man 2. Captain America, the First Avenger. Now this film, several direct references within the movie, including but not limited to, obviously there's a big part of Captain America was his relationship with Peggy Carter, and when he died, except then of course later he came back, but when he died, they made a date to go dancing, and then when he wakes up in the present, he says, "But I had a dance." Pretty significant to the emotional impact of that scene in this film. There are some other things too, like when Bucky says goodbye to him at the end of the film. That's a direct quote from when he says goodbye to Bucky in this film, The First Avenger. And I would say understanding Captain America's story arc in general, this film is pretty important. So I'm actually going to put this film as a top tier film, The Avengers. Now, in this film, of course, they go back in time and they go to the Avengers. However, I don't think there are any particular scenes or moments in the film The Avengers that have an effect on any actions or choices or lines by characters in this movie, other than the fact that they go to the actual movie. So I'd say it's very important, but I don't think there's a lot that you would miss if you hadn't seen the Avengers. So I'm going to put it at high tier, second to the top. Not the most important, but it's still very, very important. Okay, Iron Man 3. There's a few references to this film. Of course, it's the first time that Pepper was seen wearing an Iron Man suit, I believe, which comes back in this film. And of course, the kid that Tony helps out in this movie and who helps out Tony in this movie shows up at Tony's funeral in Avengers Endgame. So there's a couple things, and the fact that he had the surgery to get rid of the arc reactor, I guess, is relevant too. But as a whole, I would say there aren't really scenes where I was like, oh, because of what happened in Iron Man 3 or anything like that. They were just like casual references that are like, yes, we are aware that this movie happened, but it didn't seem like this movie was incredibly important to anything. So I'm going to put it in the low tier. It's not completely irrelevant like our buddy Hulk here, but yeah, still not that important. So, Thor the Dark World, just like Avengers, they go back to this movie in the movie. It's important to that extent, and not much more. Again, this is not asking how relevant a film is to Infinity War, it's asking how relevant it is to Endgame. Captain America, the Winter Soldier. Of course, there's the Hail Hydra callback in this film, the elevator scene, everything with Bucky, and a lot of Black Widow's arc are well established in this film. However, I'm not going to put it above Avengers and Thor the Dark World. I'm putting it in the same place. But I think what I found to be most important in this film were Iron Man and Captain America's sort of character arcs. So those are probably the things that I'm focusing on. Guardians of the Galaxy is the next film. Again, they time travel back to Guardians of the Galaxy just like these guys. Nebula's character arc was pretty important in this film, but I felt like that was established within the film by showing her past self and her present self and highlighting the difference between them. And so I don't think you need to have seen this movie to understand that difference because it's highlighted within the film. So I'm going to put it in a high tier. It's important, but it's not as important as these guys. All right, Avengers Age of Ultron. At the very beginning of the film, Tony comes back to Earth, and he specifically quotes this movie. He says, "I said we needed a suit of armor around the world," and Cap points out that it didn't work, and Tony said, "I said we'll lose, and you said we'll do that together too." And then he calls Captain America a liar. So that's a specific reference to Age of Ultron, of course. There are also all the characters' visions in Age of Ultron are a pretty big deal for this movie, especially Tony's vision of all the characters being dead, and he sees Cap's shield split in half, and that gets called back in Avengers Endgame when they're on the battlefield and Captain America's shield is split in half. Additionally, the name of the film itself comes from Age of Ultron. He says, that up there, that's the end game. Also, Captain America wielding Mjolnir is emotional payoff to a scene in Age of Ultron where he lifts it a tiny bit and then doesn't lift it anymore. All in all, I'd say this film is pretty important to those moments in the film. You wouldn't realize that they were references to this movie or to anything at all if you hadn't seen this movie. Whereas, say, like Guardians of the Galaxy, everything is pretty well exposited, where it's like, okay, yes, they went back and this stuff happened and that's what's going on. Whereas there's more vague, Tony talking about his vision, quoting his stuff, but you don't know the full context of what they're talking about. So I'm actually going to put this as top tier because I think without watching this movie first, you would not realize the significance of a lot of those moments in the film. So it's relevant. Ant-Man, it establishes the character of Ant-Man, establishes the quantum realm. Hank worked at S.H.I.E.L.D., and what Scott's relationship with Cassie is a little bit. But I think a lot of that stuff is even better articulated by Ant-Man and the Wasp. So I'm going to put Ant-Man in the low tier. Civil War is pretty important as the entire moment of Tony returning Cap's shield. In this movie, it doesn't really mean anything if you haven't seen Civil War. Yeah, I'd say a lot about Tony and Cap's relationship and their characters is also really solidified in Civil War, and their character arcs in this movie are directly related to what happened in Civil War, and you won't fully understand the implications if you haven't seen Civil War. So I'm putting Civil War in the top tier. Doctor Strange, it's important for mechanics of how stuff works. It's important so that you understand what's going on with the Ancient One in that one scene. I'm going to put it above Ant-Man, but not as high as these other movies, so I'm putting it mid-tier. Guardians 2. Like with Guardians 2 is kind of important to Avengers Endgame because of Nebula's character arc, and it establishes more about Rocket and Groot and their relationship. There isn't really anything in Avengers Endgame that specifically has to do with something in Guardians 2, aside from that, and that is just exposited in a scene. I'm putting here at low tier. It is relevant to the movie and they do reference it, but I think Doctor Strange and Thor and Iron Man 2 are more relevant just because of Tony's relationship with his father. And there's also the line Tony says about it's always you when he's recording his messages. That is a specific reference to when he made Pepper CEO. It's you. It's always been you. Doctor Strange, the portals are pretty, and the Ancient One are pretty pivotal to emotional impact of this movie, so I am putting it above this, but below these. Spider-Man Homecoming strengthens the establishment of Tony's relationship with Peter Parker. That's about it. I mean, when Peter sees Ned and does the little fist bump thing, you will actually understand that if you've seen Spider-Man Homecoming. Also, the instant kill mode references from that. But other than that, not much. Still more important than the Incredible Hulk to this movie, because there actually are references, at least, and things that you might not get. So we're putting it low tier. Thor Ragnarok. This movie has a pretty significant effect on where Thor is at in Endgame, and watching Thor Ragnarok is pretty important for Thor and Hulk, and especially in order to understand, where both of those characters are up to in Avengers Endgame, and for understanding Thor's reaction to Mjolnir, because he doesn't have it anymore. Because I don't feel that a lot of the emotional weight of the film is riding on Hulk and Thor, I'm not putting it on top tier. I'm putting it at high tier, but I do think it's very important, just like all these high tier films. They're all very important, just not as important as these ones. Okay, Black Panther. This movie really has very little to do with Avengers Endgame. There's some cameos, and that's about it. So we're actually putting it bottom tier. It's more significant for Infinity War, but not for Endgame, really. Avengers Infinity War. Yeah, that's easy, right? Obviously, top tier. Ant-Man and the Wasp. Yeah, like I said before, this film does a better job than Ant-Man at really explaining what the quantum realm is about. And it also establishes his relationship with Hope. And I feel like it does a better job of showing his relationship with Cassie as well, which is significant. So I'm putting it up here above Ant-Man. Still, none of that is as important as these films. And lastly, Captain Marvel. Well, Captain Marvel is a character who's in this movie, and that's about it. Same as Hulk, so bottom tier. Those are my rankings of how relevant each MCU film is to Avengers Endgame. Let me know in the comments if you agree or disagree. I think there are probably plenty of accurate views, but these are my opinions on how important each movie is. Yeah, I hope you enjoyed this video.